Hello, 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 hello. Ah, there I am. Yes, malicious compliance. Everyone knows it's the best type. So, hi everyone. My name is Austin Parker. You might know me from the internet. And if you don't, you're probably going to get a pretty good idea of what I'm about from the next 15, 20 minutes. So, professionally, I am the head of developer relations at Lightstep, a ServiceNow company. We work on observability, open telemetry, things like that. And personally, I've been really interested in observability for a long time, before even I got into DevRel when I was in engineering and SRE and DevOps. And as I've kind of spent more time in the industry and I've thought a lot about the sort of problems that we face every day, I started to try to apply that thinking to organizations as well and people and how these things function together. So what I want to do today is take you through about 20-odd years of socio-technical movements and talk about this idea of commodification, right? And then tie all this together and give you some interesting insights into where we can go next. So briefly, we can say that any kind of socio-technical movement is like SRE, is a reaction to the commodification of prior socio-technical movements. I wrote a blog about this a couple years ago. You can actually find it linked from that social.ap2.io site. And you can read through things in detail, so I don't want to dwell on every single one of those points. I want to kind of just give an overview and start at the beginning with a brief history of these socio-technical movements. And there are three really interesting ones, right? There's Agile, DevOps, and SRE. And in the way we actually use these and in popular consciousness, they kind of did come in this order, right? Like we went from Agile and then DevOps and now SRE. So let's start talking about Agile. The Agile Manifesto was published in 2001, and it began with these words: "We are uncovering better ways of developing software by doing it and helping others do it." To continue, individuals and interactions over processes and tools, working software over comprehensive documentation, customer collaboration over contract negotiation, responding to change over following a plan. While there is value in items on the right, we value the items on the left more. And I've been able to think about Agile quite a bit recently because one of the really exciting things about being acquired by a major enterprise software company is you learn how many incredibly successful businesses around the world don't use Agile at all. Like they barely even sniff it. And that's because they don't need to, right? Like at a certain scale, when organizations get to be a certain size, they're not in the business of like selling technology anymore. They're selling solutions. And those solutions don't need to be running in Kubernetes, and they don't need to be using Terraform or Docker. If Kubernetes went away tomorrow, that would probably be bad for a lot of us. But if Excel went away tomorrow, the world would end. At a certain scale, organizations need things like hierarchy and control because they're trying to make massive amounts of people, hundreds of thousands of employees, swim in the same direction, row the boat, one way and not the other. But that sort of hierarchy stands in contrast to the Agile philosophy, right? Like in the history page, you can see a quote: "At the core, I believe Agile methodologists are really about mushy stuff, about delivering good products to customers by operating in an environment that does more than talk about people as our most important asset, but actually acts as if people were the most important and loses the word asset," right? Agile is very explicitly this kind of mushy cultural values-y thing that stands in opposition to very top-down systems of control, right? Things like Scrum, things like waterfall development. And it was supposed to be implemented bottoms up, not top-down. But over the years, Agile was commodified, right? These cultural values were kind of pulled away from it. It was turned into something that you can, have Accenture or Deloitte or many other wonderful companies come in and sell you through things like the Scaled Agile framework, or even stuff like Jira, right, where we can assign people story points. Amy brought this up in her plenary session, right, where developer productivity tooling that comes in and it's like, hey, I see you got 40 points there, let's give you 50. And let's start making metrics out of how many tickets you're closing or how many times you're pushing to prod. And that is the definition of a commodity, right? We've taken this thing, this sort of movement, and turned it into something you can buy and sell and trade in the industry. So what happened next? Well, DevOps happened. And again, DevOps, you can see the through line from what happened with Agile in 2001 to the first DevOps days in Get in 2009. And in a lot of ways, very similar themes, right? DevOps is practitioner-led. It emphasizes local decision-making control. It emphasizes ownership. And it seeks to professionalize a lot of like admin work and ops work, right? Stuff that was not necessarily highly valued. And it did it through these sort of human connections of saying like, well, hey, we should all be kind of working together on this stuff, right? I think what's interesting is that very quickly you saw books like the Phoenix Project, right? And it's a great book, but it's written from the perspective of an IT administrator, right? It's written from like the executive position. I mean, the forcing function of the book is this guy like walks in and is like, hey, you're the VP of IT now, fix all these problems. And this is a quote from it, right? Developers are even worse than networking people. They obviously, the author or the narrator obviously has a great opinion of how valuable developers are. And you can also go and see a lot of other outcomes of this, right? Like DevOps is also a product. You can buy something. You can take out your credit card today and go on the interwebs and find a product that is major cloud provider name here, DevOps, and it's like, that seems like a product, not a cultural revolution. And thus enters SRE, right? The reaction to how DevOps is commodified. We're taking back all of the mushy, we're taking back everything, and we're making it mushy and cultural again, and it's great because it synthesizes, really in a very explicit way, the mushy cultural parts of Agile and the more automation and machinery-focused parts, the technical parts of DevOps. And it's really getting towards this like cultural reformation, right? Like what are we actually talking about with Agile and DevOps and SRE? And a lot of it has to do with like the people that are doing the work, the people that are building the systems that are responsible for them should have a pretty big say in how that work gets done, right? And who gets to make priorities. And I don't think that it's an accident that two things have happened. One, that the SRE book, published by O'Reilly, has been their most popular book for the past 7 or 8 years now. And that book gets brought in and treated as, a guidebook. It says people will come in and say, okay, well, we're going to do SRE now. And how are we going to do it? Everyone gets a copy of this, and then we just start implementing all these lessons because if it worked for Google, it should work for us. There's a lot of commonality. Thank you. There's a lot of commonality between these movements, as I expressed, right? They all build on each other. And as each rises in popularity and then kind of flattens off and is turned into a commodity, it is diminished and something else comes up to take its place. And I think the one big thing that you see through all of these things is really clearly spelled out in the Agile Manifesto in that opening part, right? It's about individuals and interactions. And we can trace all of this back to something far before anyone even heard of Kubernetes, and that is this really cool political philosophy called anarchism. Now, I'm not going to stand up here and tell you what to think. I'm going to share some books from some famous authors, such as Peter Kropotkin and Murray Bookchin, and just kind of stay with me through the story, right? The first really important point I want to bring up is about something called mutual aid. And mutual aid was kind of defined and written into philosophy by a guy named Peter Kropotkin. He was a 19th century Russian anarchist, revolutionary, a lot of things. And he had actually a very fascinating personal story that I recommend you read up on, right? He was born into the nobility, sort of a minor noble family, became very interested in the working conditions of like the peasants and serfs, and was eventually exiled. And then some stuff happened and came back. He wrote books like The Conquest of Bread and another one called Mutual Aid, A Factor of Evolution. So I want to focus on that second book right now, and this is a quote from it as you see here. It is not love and not even sympathy about which society is based in mankind. It is the conscious, be it only at the stage of an instinct of human solidarity. Kropotkin points out this close dependency that we all have on each other, right, as individuals interacting. And he finds within history, within the animal kingdom, insects, various other things, that this is very consistent through, most of recorded history, prehistory, even again into animals and plants and stuff. And it's important to keep in mind, right? This is the 19th century, this is the late 1800s. Darwinian evolution was like stupid dummy popular. People really loved talking about how great, mankind, human beings were, specifically very specific types of European or men, white men in Europe, and how great they were, and how every other culture, had been diminished and destroyed because they weren't great, right? They didn't have that gut, they didn't have that grit and drive to go out and do all the cool stuff that white dudes did. And people would base this on like the animal kingdom, right? They'd be like, oh, look at the lions running around and killing our people and whatever. So Kropotkin brings up the example of ants. And ants are super fascinating because you think about an ant, one single tiny ant, sucks, right? Sorry for ant fans. But an ant has this really obvious color. You know, it can't really do a lot. It has real tiny little jaws and stingers and can't defend itself. But ants don't work individually, right? They work as a colony. When ants go out and they find food, they will leave trails for other ants to follow. Ants will kind of share in the labor of keeping things running. When ants are hungry or thirsty, other ants will feed them without any expectation of reciprocity, right? And when ants are like being jerks to other ants in the same colony, the ants will actually fight the one that is being a jerk more than they would fight an enemy of their colony, right? They keep their friends close and their friendly enemies closer. And this isn't just ants, this is termites, this is birds, this is so many other species that we can see in the world that have this kind of same mutual aid where they treat each other, very well, and it leads to this, right? It leads to this idea of mutual confidence and individual initiative. If we all work together, we can accomplish more than we can apart. If you look at prehistory as well, like if you look into human civilizations and cultures, you also see these same patterns emerging, but no one remembers them, right? And that's because of this. We don't, historians aren't in the business of recording all the good, boring things that happen. They're really only interested in the bad, exciting things, because that sells more books. And I think this is a really poignant line, right? The bright and sunny days are lost sight in the gales and storms. And I connect this to SRE, right? Because if you think about what do we do as SRE quite often, we want this really good pattern of like postmortems, and we want to make sure we record all the incidents and all the learnings, but there's not as much attention paid to like the days where nothing breaks. Like how are we actually recording that knowledge and passing it forward to future generations of SREs and to other people in the org? The job of the SRE is to build this mutual confidence in the development team, right, in the organization. And through that mutual confidence, individual initiative can flourish. It draws from this practice of mutual aid by building support networks, right, by empowering people to take initiative and do stuff and be able to do it safely, right? Like you can think of mutual confidence as this idea of psychological safety in practice because, again, together we can do more than we can apart. So another important thinker is this guy named Murray Bookchin. He was a 20th century philosopher, anarchist, ecologist, and a real big fan of decentralization. Also from Vermont. Shout out to another Vermont king. What up, Bernie? Okay, no, that was a joke for one person in the audience, and I hope they got it. Broadly, his work focuses on the progress towards post-scarcity societies, of how humanity can kind of live in concert with nature, the synthesized social and technological change, but without becoming into like degrowth or primitivism or like this idea that like, oh, humanity will invariably ruin the earth and we have to stop doing stuff. So he wrote a bunch of essays on this and a bunch of books, but there's a specific collection of them called Social Ecology and Communalism that I'll be excerpting over the next several slides. The ultimate kind of point of a lot of what Bookchin gets to is in this, right? From his first essay on social ecology, it's based on the conviction that our present ecological problems originate in deep-seated social problems. In effect, the way that we deal with each other as social beings is crucial to addressing the crisis of ecology. And he goes on through this, and I recommend you read it because it's pretty interesting and in-depth. And it comes down to relationships between people, right? Like who is getting to make decisions about the ecology? Who gets to make decisions about our software systems, right? Who gets to make decisions about sprints and team planning and da-da-da-da-da? There's sort of the connection. That discussion invariably leads to this question of power relationships, right? I mentioned it earlier a little bit. Why are all these movements co-opted? Why are they commodified? Agile, DevOps, SRE, why do people make products of it? Why do they sell books about it? It's because success is co-opted and commodified by society. There are structural incentives for business to run the way it does. And to this point, modern capitalism is a structurally amoral thing which is impervious to moral appeals, right? We can talk all we want about how great psychological safety is and how much it helps us grow as individuals and whatever else, but capitalism will subsume all of this. It has an infinite capacity to subsume these critiques. And that is what all of this is, right? In my personal view is that Agile, DevOps, SRE, all of these are socio-technical movements that are about power in the workplace and thus power in society. You know, the success isn't co-opted just because there's a structural incentive for business to do it and they don't understand moral appeals. It's also because if you can co-opt it, you can blunt its effectiveness and you can stop people from trying to do things together. You can reimpose hierarchies. And it isn't actually subtext, right? Like, I'm not just pulling things out of whole cloth. If you look at the Agile Manifesto and you look at the history, like, people specifically are referencing anarchy in that, right? Like, there are deep roots to all these things we talk about. So what can SRE do to help with this, to sort of move forward with this in mind? Well, one is I think we need to take the advice of Bookchin and we need to build communality, right? We need to turn our peers, our friends, wherever we are doing SRE, we're building citizens, not workers. We're building people that are empowered and able to become an active member of, their community, rather than a irreplaceable worker. An SRE isn't a mythic hero that is coming in with their sword and slaying all the dragons for people, right? You're an organizer. You're coming in and you're bringing people together and saying, like, hey, here's how you can use your initiative and build your confidence and courage up so that together we can do more than we could do individually. It creates that confidence through this cycle of education, right? Not just writing down all the misses and forgetting the hits, and also not just by blindly following dogma about what they did at Google or Shopify or Lightstep or, no one is immune to this, right? We need to embrace this idea of responsible consumption and cultivation of our platforms, of our people, and we do this through knowledge and learning and continuously bringing those lessons back in. And we support that initiative that we're giving people through structure, right? We need to recognize that there are leaders. Maybe we are those leaders in many cases, but leadership doesn't mean to be put on a pedestal. It means to create structures and regulations, right? It means to create guardrails so that we're able to work safely and securely together and to build accountability between those that are leading and those that are led, not just for people, but for technology. Shout out OpenAI or Twitter. Ultimately, our goal should always be to distribute power and authority in the organization, right, in our communities. The more that people have direct control over their environment, over what they do, that leads to better outcomes for pick their thing. If I can leave you with just one thing, I want to come and wrap this up, and it's that I've spent the past 20 minutes or so talking about a lot of stuff, and I don't want you to take my word for it. I want you to go out. I'm going to show you some citations on the next page. These are great things to read. They're actually not, it's 400 or 500 pages. Read some stuff that wasn't just published by O'Reilly. One exception, Distributed Tracing in Practice, great book. Check that out. And then Learning Open Telemetry coming this fall. Definitely buy those and leave me 5 stars on Goodreads. But yes, go out and do some liberal arts, right? Like a lot of really great SREs I've known have not had a technical background. And learning and thinking about this stuff, like even if you don't personally agree with it, if this doesn't map to your political philosophy, that's fine. Like you can still grow as a person and you can still kind of see these interesting connections in the world around us and in the things we talk about and in the concrete goals that we're trying to achieve through SRE and through our professional lives. So thank you for your time. I'll probably mostly be taking questions async, but we might have time for one more. And I also want to shout out my makeup artists. If you notice, this is color coordinated with the slides. Anna Margarita Medina, Hazel Weekly, thanks. And thank you.